Today's passage is from the book of Genesis, chapter 37, verses 1 through 36. Genesis 37, 1 through 36. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, and the sons of Bilhah, and the sons of Zephra, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he had made him a richly ornamented robe for him. When the brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him and mocked him because of the dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father this as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flock near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off to the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I am looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe that he was wearing. And they took him and threw him into a cistern. Now the cistern was empty, there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. The camels were loaded with spices, balms, and myrrh, and they were on their way down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to these Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned from the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" They got Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it and see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "in my mourning I will go down to the grave to my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Whenever one of God's creatures gives birth, it is a miraculous, awe-inspiring, and sometimes just a little bit insane. A Christian speaker and writer named Gary Ritter once said that he had been at the zoo at the exact right moment to see a giraffe giving birth. Now, I'll say right off, a giraffe giving birth sounds like kind of a crazy experience, but Gary's description far exceeds my expectations. Gary arrived just as the giraffe was beginning to go into labor, and he was standing next to a zookeeper named Jack Banal. And Gary had many questions, and Jack seemed happy to answer it. At first, Jerry watched as the hooves and the head made their way out of the mother giraffe, and he asked Jack, "When's this giraffe going to lay down?" Jack said, "She won't." Gary looked at this giraffe and realized the baby was coming from about 10 feet up in the air. And so Gary asked, "Isn't someone going to go in there and try to catch the baby giraffe?" And Jack said, "Well, you can try, but just remember that mother has enough strength in her back legs to kick your head clean off." Well, Gary watched a little longer, and finally the baby giraffe tumbled out of its mother and fell to the ground and landed hard on its back. And it just lay there, motionless, for about 60 seconds. Then something kind of shocking happened. The mother giraffe, with those powerful legs, kicked the baby so hard that it rolled over a few times. And Gary asked Jack, "Why did she do that?" Jack said, "She wants the baby to get up." Apparently the infant knew what its mother wanted because it started to struggle up to its legs and faltered and finally just fell down and couldn't do it. Bam! Mother kicked it again. Finally, the baby got the message and again struggled and got up to its legs. And Gary watched in awe as this infant giraffe took its first few steps. Bam! The mom kicked it down again. This time Jack didn't wait for Gary to ask. He said, the mom wants it to remember how to get up. In the wild, if an animal can't get up quickly and keep up with the herd, then it'll be picked off by predators. That is a crazy story to me. But I want to say, I have something in common with that baby giraffe. I mean, beyond having legs that are disproportionately too long for my body. It is this. I've been kicked down before. I've been kicked off my feet. I've been kicked while I was down. I have been kicked by those who I thought were there to support me. Can I get an amen? Amen. I think we've all had that experience in life. We know what it's like to get kicked down. We're going through life, we're minding our own business, we're just trying to keep our head above water, and bam, something just sideswipes us, knocks us off our feet, and we're not sure how to get back up. Or maybe we've been down for a while, we've struggled, and finally we're starting to see a light at the end of the tunnel, starting to move in the right direction, and someone who we thought was on our side kicks us back down. I think it's an experience a lot of us have had. And how we deal with that experience, how we deal with being kicked while we're down, says a lot about who we are as people and what we believe about God. And today, I want to look at a story of a guy who got kicked down. As we pick up the story in Genesis today, it's really a new section of Genesis. Isaac has died, and so now Jacob is the patriarch of the family. However, because of his age, Jacob will be less active than he had been before. Beyond that, not long after Isaac died, Jacob's wife, Rachel, also died, and this will cause Jacob to withdraw into himself and be much less active in events. The story is going to focus instead on Jacob's 12 sons, particularly Jacob's second to youngest son, Joseph. Now, as we pick up the story, Joseph is 17 years old, and as they say, the future is so bright he's got to wear shades. Everything seems to be going well for for Joseph. But he's going to run into some problems with his brothers. His brothers will become bitter towards Joseph. And they're going to do something truly cruel to him. However, unlike his brothers, Joseph will go through a trauma. He'll be kicked by people who he thought were on his side, by his own family members. But he won't become bitter because of it. The problem between Joseph and his brothers really goes back to their father. Jacob had been playing favorites. He had been favoring Joseph over his other brothers. If you've been in church pretty much all throughout your life, you've probably heard the famous story of Joseph and the coat of many colors. Jacob gave Joseph this ornate, multicolored coat. And the coat itself would have been valuable. The dyeing clothes at the time was a big deal. This was not a time we could go down to Sherwin-Williams and pick out one of 15,000 different colors or whatever they have. If you were going to dye some clothing, it was a major undertaking. And to dye a single garment several different colors was a serious effort. This coat was valuable. But beyond the coat itself, it's what the coat symbolized. Jacob was choosing Joseph as his new heir. Reuben, Jacob's oldest son, had done something wrong that I'm not going to get into today. But Jacob used Reuben's sin as an excuse to withdraw his blessing from Reuben. He then skipped over the next 9 sons in line to give his blessing to Joseph, to declare Joseph as his new heir. Now, I've heard preachers try to justify Jacob in this. I mean, Jacob did have the legal right to do this. And they say, well, whether Jacob was wrong or right. No. Jacob was wrong. He was playing favorites. This was a generational sin for Jacob's family. Isaac, Jacob's father, had been playing favorites between his 2 sons. And then Jacob played favorites between his 2 wives. He loved one wife and mistreated the other. And then later he played favorites between his wife's children. Jacob loved his wife Rachel, and so he favored and cared for her children. He did not love his wife Leah, and so he mistreated and dishonored her children. And this mistreatment will cause bitterness among Joseph's brothers. And it's important that we understand that Jacob was mistreating his sons. The man who should have been caring for his sons was kicking them while they were down. And that matters because Joseph's brothers had a legitimate grievance against Joseph and their father. They were being mistreated. Their father, who should have cared for them, was dishonoring them. And Joseph arrogantly and selfishly went along with it, ignoring what was right and ignoring the needs of his brothers. They had a legitimate grievance here. And this grievance caused them to become bitter towards Joseph. Now, the Hebrew word for bitterness literally means an acid or a poison that causes the skin to blister and will kill someone who holds on to it. The best way I can describe the biblical concept of bitterness is to say that bitterness is anger that is hardened. This is anger that we've held on to until it became solid and hard in our lives. It's not a fiery, quick anger, though that may come along with it. Bitterness is an anger that we've nurtured and coddled and kept in our lives until it's hardened into a part of us. And generally speaking, there are 2 causes of bitterness in our lives. One can be bitterness from the circumstances of life. Things have not gone our way. Things have not gone the way we expected them to go. We face loss and disappointment. We feel that life is leaving us behind. It's not anybody's fault. It just is. But it causes us to become bitter. Joseph's brothers had this kind of bitterness. Joseph told them about some dreams he had. In one dream, they were binding sheaves of grain, and the sheaves of grain stood up, and Joseph's brothers' sheaves all bowed down to his sheaf. In another dream, Joseph saw the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down to him. The implication is obvious. Joseph thought that his parents and his brothers would one day bow down to him. Now, Joseph probably could have been a little more tactful in stating this dream, but he didn't really do anything wrong here. If he just talked about a dream, if this dream was just a dream, then it was just a dream. If it was a dream from God, then it was a description of the future that neither Joseph nor his brothers had any power to change. When they heard this, Joseph's brothers could have accepted that life doesn't always go the way that they want, that there is disappointment in life, and they could have let it go. Instead, they got angry at Joseph for this dream. They blamed him for the dream, and they became bitter towards him because their younger brother was coming out ahead of them. The second cause of bitterness for Joseph's brothers came from their mistreatment from their father. That Jacob and Joseph were mistreating them, that those who should have been on their side were kicking them while they were down. So they both faced both kinds of resentment and bitterness. One from circumstances of life and one just from how people had treated them. And in our lives today, we will face temptation to bitterness from both these sources. We'll face a temptation to bitterness just from these circumstances of life that aren't really anybody's fault, just beyond control. And we'll face temptation of bitterness because of what someone has done to us. Here's the thing. The cause of bitterness doesn't really matter. Whether we are bitter because of circumstances of life or whether we are bitter because of what someone does, either way, we're still the one holding on to the acid that is eating us alive. We're still the ones suffering from this bitterness. And we see that in Joseph's brothers' lives. Their bitterness burnt away at them. In the book of Ephesians, Paul tells us to get rid of all bitterness, anger, and rage. Get rid of it because bitterness is deadly to us. It eats away at our lives. And so Paul tells us to get rid of it. And we see again this in Joseph's brothers' lives, that because of their bitterness, they did something completely out of proportion to what Joseph deserved. They faked Joseph's death and had him sold as a slave to Egypt. They brought suffering to Joseph's life, to Jacob's life, and ultimately to their own lives. So how do we avoid that? How do we avoid that destructive act of bitterness in life? If we are dealing with bitterness, how do we get free of it? First, let me say that it is far easier to avoid bitterness in the first place. Once bitterness hardens into our lives, it is much more difficult to wash out. So avoid it before it gets there. Seek forgiveness quickly. Take every opportunity to be at peace. Bring our grievances and our disappointments to God before they harden into bitterness. Actively seek the opportunity to let go of what has upset us. It is far, far easier to forgive, to let go early on before something hardens into bitterness. Okay, that's all well and good as long as we take the advice in time, but what if we're already there? What if bitterness has already set into our lives? How can we be free of it? Well, I think there are some things we can do. I'm going to close today's sermon by telling you about 5 ways that we can be free of bitterness in our lives. First, we recognize bitterness for what it is. First, we need to examine our lives to see if we are dealing with bitterness. And I think there are a few warning signs of bitterness in our lives. If we think about something that has upset us essentially every day, If we see someone, do we consistently still feel something sharp and ugly inside of us? If someone else has been blessed by God, do we wonder how God could bless that person after what she has done? Do we gossip or talk about something that has upset us at least once every week? If you find any one or more of those things to be true in your life, particularly if this is something that has lasted for several months or more, you need to take a hard look at your life, because there's a good chance that bitterness has started to set in. And we need to recognize what bitterness is. Because, as I say, the first step to a cure is recognizing that there is a problem. So we start by recognizing what bitterness is. Second, we need a time of serious self-evaluation. We need to ask ourselves, why are we bitter? Why are we upset? Who is it that we are angry at? Are we angry at another person? Are we angry at God? What specifically has caused this bitterness? And in a moment where we feel that bitterness rise up, what has brought it on? What, in that specific moment, caused bitterness to rise up in us? We need to have a time of self-reflection. Third, ask why. Why is this growing in my life? Why is bitterness still having an effect on me? Why am I holding on to it? And along those same lines, fourth, give me a slide, Christian. Consider what you're willing to give up to hold on to that bitterness. Consider what cost you're willing to pay to remain bitter. Because I can guarantee you, if you are going through bitterness, it is costing you something. It might be, at the very minimum, costing peace of mind, peace in your relationship with God, and a lot of your hope for the future. How much are you willing to pay to hold on to that bitterness? Because once bitterness sets in, there's no easy path forward. Letting go of bitterness is hard. Once it has settled in, once it has hardened in our life, being free of bitterness is difficult. Holding on to bitterness is also hard. It comes with a cost in our lives. Once bitterness is settled in, there is no easy way out. So we have to ask ourselves, what am I willing to give up to hold on to this bitterness in my life? Is it worth it? And fifth, and finally, pray. That really first, second, third, fourth, and fifth is pray. We need to pray as we have a time to analyze our own lives. That we need to pray to ask God to show us any bitterness in our lives. We need to pray to ask God to help us reflect on our lives, to ask why this is still happening. And we need to pray to ask God's help in letting go. But specifically, when I say pray, I mean pray for the person or situation that has caused your bitterness. If you are dealing with bitterness right now, pray for what it is that has caused you to become bitter. If it is a circumstance in life, perhaps you lost out on a promotion or a job that you really were looking for. Maybe you've been dealing with a physical ailment. Pray for the circumstance. If you lost out on a job or a promotion, pray for the company that has turned you down. If you're dealing with a physical ailment, pray that God's strength will be seen in your weakness. If you're struggling with loss, pray that God will use that to bring praise to his name. Pray for the specific circumstance that has caused bitterness. And if bitterness has come from another person, if you're bitter towards a person, pray for that person. Jesus said, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who persecute you. If you are feeling bitterness towards another person, pray for that person. It is nearly impossible to to remain bitter towards a person while we are praying for God to bless that person. Prayer is the key to being free of bitterness. And I think, really, in our heart of hearts, most of us already know that. We know that if we take on a regimen of prayer for another person, then God is going to thaw our hearts and release us of that bitterness. I think that's why a lot of people are hesitant to start praying, because there's that part of us that doesn't want to let go. There's that part of us that wants to hold on to this bitterness, even as it is eating away at me. I don't want to let it go. And we know that if I start to pray for God to bless the person I am bitter towards, then God is going to cleanse that bitterness out of me. But if we look at our lives, if we count the cost that bitterness has brought into our lives, if we get to the point that we want to forgive, even if we're not actually forgiving yet, then pray. Pray for that person we are bitter towards, and God will set us free of bitterness. Bitterness is a reality in our world. We have all been kicked down at some point in our lives. We have all had people kick us while we were down. But we have a God who heals us. We have a God who helps us stand. We have a God who sets us free from the bitterness of this world. And if you desire to be free of that bitterness, we have a God who wants to get you there. We have a God who wants to set you free. All we need is to want to be free. In a moment, we're going to stand for an invitation hymn. And as we stand to sing, if bitterness has been eating away at your life, and you desire to be free of it, you have an opportunity. This week, talk to myself, talk to one of the elders, or even right now, if you need to start the change away from bitterness, you have an opportunity. As you'll stand with me for an invitation hymn, which is Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, and we'll sing all the verses.